Sometimes the sweetest surprises are just traps wrapped in love. And that morning, the morning sun spilled gently through the kitchen window, painting the wooden table in soft gold. Grace stood by the stove, humming an old tune as she flipped a pancake, its edges crisping to a perfect golden brown. The aroma of butter and freshly brewed coffee filled the room, wrapping around her like a warm embrace. It was a simple, peaceful weekend morning, the kind she cherished in her quiet home. A life built not on noise or grandeur, but on small steps. Then came the sound of the front door creaking open. Grace turned spatula in hand. Ethan and Chloe stepped inside, smiles blooming on their faces, brighter than usual, almost too bright. "You're both up early." Ethan chuckled, exchanging a quick glance with his wife. "Mom, we have a—" Chloe stepped forward, something hidden behind her back. A small pastel blue envelope tied with a golden ribbon. With a teasy. Grace took it, curiosity lighting her eyes. Her fingers trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon and lifted the flow. "Oh my goodness." Ethan nodded proudly. "You've been taking care of everything for so long, Mom. You deserve this. It's time to rest, to enjoy yours." Chloe added softly, "You've done so much for us. Let this be our way of saying thank you." Grace pressed a hand into her chest, overwhelmed by emotion. For years, she had carried this family. "You too," she whispered, voice trembling. "I don't even know what to say. Thank you, truly." Her eyes glistened. In that moment, every sacrifice, every long night, every quiet worry, it all felt worth it. Maybe this, she thought, is what love looks like when it grows up. Later that day, the house was filled with the soft rustle of preparation. Grace moved from room to room, folding each piece of clothing, carefully sliding them neatly into her suitcase. At the bottom, she placed a small wooden photo. "John," she murmured with a tender smile, "can you believe it? Our boy's grown up. He's learned how to take care of his mother." The suitcase snapped shut with a soft click. It was such a simple sound, yet it echoed with contentment. The kind only. She brewed herself one last cup of tea before the trip, savoring the warmth between her palms. The sunlight stretched across the floor. "Good!" She opened her old notebook and wrote a single line on a fresh page. "Today I am loved." She smiled as she closed it. But love, when misplaced, can be the cruelest illusion. Because behind every smile that morning, something flickered. A hesitation in Ethan's eyes. A stiffness in Chloe's voice. If Grace had looked closer, she might have noticed. But when your heart is full. The next morning dawned bright and beautiful. Birds sang outside the window. Ethan loaded her suitcase into the car, calling out cheerfully, "Come on, Mom, flight's at 10. We've got time to grab beer." Chloe waved from the doorway, her voice sweet and steady. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect. Grace took one last look at her home. The ivy climbing across the porch. The old rocking chair John had built. The kitchen window where she'd stood every sunrise for decades. Every corner carried a memory. Every brick. She smiled. Then, I thought it was a vacation of gratitude. But it turned out tea from the very home I built with love. The morning unfolded like any other journey filled with hope. Grace sat in the back seat, sunlight flickering across her face as the car glided down the quiet suburban road. Ethan drove humming softly, while Chloe scrolled through her phone, a content smile resting on her lips. Grace looked out the window, watching the familiar streets blur into motion. She thought about the ocean breeze, the scent of hibiscus flowers, the laughter she'd soon share with strangers on the sand. For once, life felt easy. Safe. But fate, cunning and precise, was already waiting for her first mistake. When they arrived at the airport, Ethan parked by the drop-off lane. Grace reached into her handbag for her documents. Her smile faded. She rummaged again, then froze. "My passport. I can't find it." Chloe leaned closer. "Did you check your purse?" Yes, I had it this morning. Oh dear." Ethan turned to her, calm, reassuring. "It's okay, Mom. You probably left it on the counter. Go home, grab it. We'll check in and wait for you inside." Grace exhaled, grateful. "All right, I won't be long." She waved goodbye and stepped into the next taxi, unaware that she wasn't returning for a passport, but for the truth. The drive back was quiet, almost too quiet. As the city faded behind her, something in her chest tightened. A strange unease, small but insistent. She brushed it off. "Don't be silly, Grace. It's just a passport." The cab slowed as it turned onto her street. That's when she saw it, a silver sedan parked in front of her driveway. Unfamiliar, sleek. Not Ethan's, not any neighbors she knew. Her brows furrowed. She stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes. From inside the house, she heard voices, light, cheerful, businesslike. "This is a rare find," a man's voice said. "Fully paid, newly renovated, perfect for cash buyers." Her stomach dropped. Her hand reached for the doorknob, cold, trembling. The door was unlocked. Grace pushed it open. And there in the home she'd built, the one she'd cleaned, protected, loved, stood three strangers. A tall man in a blazer holding a folder. A young couple walking through the living room, admiring the crown moldings, running their hands along her dining table as if it already belonged to them. On the coffee table sat her photo frame, the one she'd left behind, the smiling faces of Grace, Ethan, and Chloe, staring back like ghosts from another life. Her voice broke the air, quiet but sharp. "Excuse me, what are you doing in my house?" The man turned, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. Are you the previous owner?" Her heart stumbled. "Previous owner? What do you mean?" He hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. "I was told the property's ready to be listed. I'm Mr. Johnson, the real estate agent. I was authorized by your son, Ethan. The house has already been approved for sale." The world tilted. The walls she'd painted with her own hands seemed to blur. Grace stood still, her throat tight, her heartbeat loud in her ears. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Authorized by my son," she whispered. Mr. Johnson nodded. "Yes, he said you'd already moved out for good. The buyers are eager. It's a prime deal." The young couple exchanged polite smiles, oblivious to the devastation standing before them. Grace blinked back, the sting in her eyes, forcing herself to stand tall. Every instinct screamed to cry, to shout, but she didn't. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. See? There must be some mistake." Her voice was steady, though her heart was splintering. She turned away, walking slowly toward the door. Each step echoed heavy, final. The sunlight outside was blinding. She blinked, hard, tears welling, but refusing to fall. She reached the gate, gripping the handle to steady herself. Behind her, laughter drifted out, the agent pointing at the garden, the couple nodding approvingly. Their voices blurred into a distant hum, like a memory fading too fast. Grace walked to the curb, her hands trembling. The taxi was still there, engine idling. The driver looked up. "Everything all right, ma'am?" She nodded, faintly, voice barely a whisper. Yes, everything's fine." But everything was not fine. The house she had built with her husband, the house she paid for in full, the house she gifted her son to feel close to, keep family together, had just been stolen from beneath her heart. She sank into the back seat, clutching her purse like a life raft. Out the window, the roofline of her home drifted away, the same way trust does when it's been betrayed. Her voice, low and steady, carried the weight of the truth. "I walked out of the place I once called home, and that's when I finally understood. This vacation wasn't a gesture of love. It was a carefully planned eviction." The taxi pulled away, leaving behind the street she'd once loved. Grace sat in silence, her reflection trembling in the window. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted quietly, irrevocably. Love had ended, and something new, sharper, stronger, was beginning to take its place. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was clarity, and with clarity comes power. The taxi moved through the afternoon light, each turn taking Grace farther from the house that no longer felt like hers. Outside, trees blurred into streaks of green and gold. Inside, silence hung heavy, the kind that follows a blow so deep even the air feels bruised. She sat still, hands trembling in her lap. Her breath came shallow, shaky. Yet behind her wet eyes, something had begun to clear, a new painful clarity. How could they? Her own son, her own flesh and blood. Her heart whispered the question, but her mind began to trace back the years, quietly, methodically, like a hand reopening an old book. Once, long ago, this house was nothing but a dream. She could still see the day she and John signed the papers, her signature flowing proudly across the page. John had turned to her smiling, that quiet, certain smile of his. A home isn't just walls, Grace. It's roots. It's safety. Keep it close. Guard it well. She remembered nodding, feeling the weight of the keys in her hand, heavy, sacred. Back then, Ethan was still a boy with scraped knees and big dreams. She built everything for him, every inch, every room, so that he'd never have to struggle for a roof over his head. When John passed, the house became more than shelter. It was memory, legacy, love in brick and wood. She paid every bill, signed every check. The deed bore only one name, hers. And yet, today, strangers walked its halls. Today, her own son had turned it into merchandise. Grace pressed her palm against her heart, as if trying to hold the pieces together. Her chest ached, not just with grief, but with the weight of disbelief. The car slowed at a red light. She stared out through the glass, watching the world move on, unaware of her private undoing. In the reflection, she barely recognized herself. A woman who had given everything and been repaid with betrayal. Her fingers curled into a fist. Tears threatened again, but she blinked them back. Not this time. Not now. If they saw her as a burden, she would show them the strength of being underestimated. If they thought she was weak, they had no idea what quiet resolve could do. She turned her gaze to the horizon, voice low, steady, a whisper only she could hear. If they see me as disposable, I'll remind them what value truly looks like. Grace leaned back in her seat, breathing deeper now. The pain hadn't vanished. It never does, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the ache of a wound. It was the spark of purpose. She knew what had to be done. Not shouting, not begging, not tears, nor confrontation. Her strength would not be in volume, but in vision, in precision. The same hands that built a home could also build a plan. The cab pulled to a stop outside a small cafe, one she used to visit with John on Sunday afternoons. She stepped out, the air crisp against her face, the scent of roasted beans curling through the street. Inside, she ordered tea and found a quiet corner by the window. Her reflection glimmered faintly against the glass eyes, red but burning clear. She opened her purse, pulled out her notebook, the same one she had written in the day before. Yesterday's line stared back at her. Today I am loved. Her pen hovered, then moved slow and deliberate. Today I am awake. The first fracture of innocence. The first line of defense. Her thoughts shifted to Ethan and Chloe, their smiles, their voices, the way they had spoken that morning with practiced sweetness. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It was a plan. The vacation, the timing, the smiles too bright, every detail now aligned into a pattern she could no longer ignore. They had wanted her gone, wanted the keys, wanted the deed. And they had almost succeeded. Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. She folded the notebook closed. Not yet, she whispered. You may think you've won, but the game's barely begun. As the sky turned soft and violet, she stepped outside, wind brushing through her hair. The world around her felt changed. Or maybe it was she who had changed. Once she had believed kindness was a shield. Now she knew wisdom was armor. She looked up at the fading light. There was no rage in her eyes, only resolve. No one could erase her story. No one could sell her soul along with her house. They thought they'd written her final chapter. But Grace was just beginning to write hers. Her voice, calm but certain, carried through the evening breeze. I won't fight with noise. I won't drown in tears. I'll build my justice quietly and let the truth speak louder than betrayal. She raised her hand, hailed another cab, and climbed inside. This time her hands didn't shake. Her gaze didn't wander. The destination was clear, and so was the woman she was becoming. The next morning, Grace woke early, not from habit, but from clarity. The sky outside her apartment window was pale and still, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. She sat by the table, hands folded around a cup of cooling tea. Sleep had not come easily, but determination had. For the first time in days, her heart didn't race. It beat steady, measured, certain. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until one familiar name appeared: Martha Reed. It had been years since they last spoke, but some friendships, like old trees, never die. They simply wait for the right season to bloom again. Grace hesitated only a moment before pressing call. A few hours later, she sat in a small cafe near the bus terminal, a quiet place filled with the smell of roasted beans and rain-soaked pavement. Outside, the world moved quickly. Inside, time slowed. When Martha arrived, she still had that same warm, grounded energy, a kindness sharpened by experience. Her hair was streaked with silver now, but her eyes carried the same steady fire Grace remembered from their teaching days. They hugged, and for a brief second, Grace felt something she hadn't in a while: safety. Martha pulled back, studying her friend's face. "Grace, you look like you've been through a storm." Grace exhaled, the weight of truth pressing against her ribs. "I have, and I need to tell you everything." So she did. Every word, every betrayal, every flicker of realization, Grace laid them bare. The tickets, the smiles, the unlocked door, the strangers walking through her living room. Martha listened, eyes widening, her hands tightening around her cup. When Grace finished, silence settled between them, heavy and raw. Finally, Martha spoke. Her voice was soft but firm, the way a teacher delivers a lesson that matters. "Selling your house, behind your back, without a word. Grace, that's not your son anymore. That's someone else wearing his face." Grace lowered her gaze. "I keep asking myself what I did wrong. Was I too trusting? Too soft?" Martha shook her head. "No, you were a mother. There's no sin in love. The sin is in betrayal." For a moment, neither spoke. Only the quiet hum of the cafe filled the air, the sound of espresso machines and distant chatter blending with the rhythm of their thoughts. Then Martha leaned closer, voice low, deliberate. "You said the deed's in your name, right?" Grace nodded. "Every cent came from me. I made sure of it." Martha's eyes sharpened, a spark lighting within them. "Then they can't touch it. They might try to trick you, but they can't take what isn't theirs." Grace looked up, unsure. "What do I do then? I can't just move back in." Martha smiled faintly, the smile of a woman who's fought her own battles and learned how to win quietly. "You don't move back. You move forward. You sell it before they can. Fast, clean, and legal. If they wanted a game, you play smarter." Grace blinked, processing the words. "Sell it. Myself. Yes. Quietly. And you'll need someone good, someone who knows how to close fast." She tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. "There's a man I worked with years ago, Mr. Johnson. Helped me sort out my sister's estate. Honest, efficient. No noise, no drama, just results." Grace felt something flicker inside, the first glow of control returning to her fingertips. A plan, a direction. Martha reached across the table, resting her hand over Grace's. "Listen to me, Grace. You don't need to scream to be heard. You've been silenced enough. Now you fight in a language they'll understand." Grace's voice softened. "And what language is that?" Martha's eyes gleamed. "Paperwork, contracts, signatures. You win with ink, not anger." Outside, clouds began to drift apart, letting sunlight spill through the windows. Grace turned her cup slowly, watching the reflection shimmer across the surface. Yes, no shouting, no crying, just precision. If betrayal was a transaction, so was justice. A few hours later, the two women walked side by side down Main Street. Grace clutched a folder. Martha had prepared notes, contacts, next steps. Her steps were lighter now, her gaze steady. Martha smiled, sensing the shift. "There she is, the Grace. I remember, the one who could solve any problem if she had a chalkboard and a plan." Grace chuckled softly, though her eyes remained serious. "This time the lesson's on survival." "Then make it your best one yet," Martha said. They parted with a long embrace, the kind that carries both comfort and command. Grace turned toward the bus stop, clutching the folder tight against her chest. In its weight, she felt something solid, not paper, but possibility. That evening, back in her apartment, she placed the folder on the table beside her notebook. She opened to a new page, pen poised. Yesterday, she'd written, "Today I am awake." Now she wrote, "Today I begin." Her reflection in the window looked different. Not broken, not angry, focused. Her voice, quiet yet cutting, filled the room. "I don't fight with screams. I fight with contracts." The wind stirred outside, carrying the faint scent of rain. But this time Grace didn't flinch. Because storms no longer scared her. They fueled her. The sun had already dipped low when Grace stood once again before her house. The home she once entered with love now approached with purpose. The air was still. No cars in the driveway. No laughter from the living room. Ethan and Chloe were gone just as she hoped. Grace unlocked the door and stepped inside, every sound amplified in the silence. The faint creak of the floorboards. The hush of the air through the vents. She had walked these halls 1,000 times, but never like this. This time she wasn't coming home. She was collecting evidence. In her bedroom, Grace knelt before the old oak cabinet and turned the dial of the safe. Left, right, right, left. Her fingers knew the rhythm by heart, though they trembled slightly with every click. The final turn released the lock with a satisfying snap. Inside neat stacks of papers, waited patient, untouched. She drew them out one by one, laying them on the bed. The property deed signed solely in her name. The bank statements that traced every payment. The receipts from when she'd furnished each room, her pride, her taste, her sweat turned tangible. Each document was more than proof. It was testimony. Grace sat at the edge of the bed, sorting through the pile. Years of effort, reduced to ink and stamps, yet powerful enough to rebuild her freedom. She opened a fresh notebook, the same one that had carried her thoughts through every storm. On the first page, she drew 2 columns. In one she wrote, "Assets with proof of purchase," and began listing carefully, precisely. Italian leather sofa, invoice dated May 14th, 2016. Dishwasher, Model X9, bought with cash receipt attached. Japanese chef's knives, wedding anniversary gift to herself. In the other column she wrote, "Sentimental keepsakes." And there, the list softened, handwritten letters from John Ethan's first, drawing the family photo by the oak tree. When she finished, she paused, pen hovering above the page, then wrote a single line across the bottom. "Every piece paid for with my own sweat. Every corner earned." She closed the notebook and exhaled, her heartbeat steady, her breathing calm. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel small. She felt grounded, like a builder walking through the foundation of a new home. Next, she arranged the papers into folders, labeling each in neat handwriting. Ownership, purchases, proof. Every label was a line of defense. Every staple a shield. The quiet rustle of documents filled the room, not frantic, but rhythmic, deliberate. Grace wasn't acting from rage anymore. She was building order from betrayal. When the last folder was sealed, she reached for her phone and scrolled to a new contact, Mr. Johnson. Her thumb hovered for only a second before she pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then connected. "Mrs. Walker." His voice came warm and professional. "Did you manage to gather everything?" Grace looked around at the stack spread across her bed, proof of a life neatly itemized. "Yes," she said quietly. "Every document, every receipt, all in my name." There was a brief pause. Then Mr. Johnson's tone shifted, crisp, confident. "Good. That means your ownership is airtight. No one can touch this without your consent." Grace nodded to herself, eyes steady. "That's what I needed to hear." "In that case," he continued, "I already have a cash buyer waiting. Someone discreet. We can close in 1 week if you're ready." Her heart lifted not with excitement, but with resolve. "I'm ready." They spoke a little longer, confirming details, signatures, witnesses, confidentiality. Each word built another wall around her security. When the call ended, Grace placed the phone beside her notebook, her reflection glimmering faintly in the screen. It wasn't the face of a victim. It was the face of a strategist. She gathered the folders into a leather briefcase John had once used for work. Its handle was worn, the brass corners scuffed, but it felt right, like she was carrying both memory and mission. As she zipped it shut, she whispered under her breath, 1 week, a promise, a countdown, a quiet declaration of independence. In the living room, she walked slowly past the furniture she had chosen, the curtains she had sewn, the walls she had painted. Every object was a page in her story, and now each would serve as evidence in her liberation. She stopped before the family portrait on the mantel. For a moment, her eyes lingered on Ethan's smile. The boy she raised, the man who betrayed her. But instead of tears, only clarity came. Love built this house, she murmured, but law will save me from it. Outside, the last light of day stretched across the driveway, warm and golden, the same hue as the morning she once mistook for love. Grace stepped out, locked the door behind her, and didn't look back. Not out of sorrow, but out of strength. Her steps were slow, but firm, measured. Every stride an act of reclaiming. Because power, she'd learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the sound of a pen signing your own destiny. The next day dawned soft and gray, a calm sky before a quiet storm. Grace sat by the window, watching the light slide across the walls. Every shadow felt like a secret she now carried. It was time. The papers were ready. The deed was hers. The plan precise, simple, silent. Today, she would sell the house she once built from love, and now needed to leave for freedom. She waited until Ethan and Chloe had driven off for work, their laughter echoing faintly down the street. When the last sound faded, she pulled out her phone and typed a short message. "I've got a visitor this afternoon. Don't come home early." Short, polite, harmless. The kind of message that didn't invite questions. She hit send, exhaled slowly, and stood. Her reflection in the hallway mirror looked calm, but beneath that stillness ran a current of nerves, not fear, but anticipation. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration. By 3 o'clock, a car pulled into the driveway. A young couple stepped out, polite, well-dressed, their eyes bright with the curiosity of new beginnings. Behind them, Mr. Johnson followed, briefcase in hand, his expression composed and discreet. "Mrs. Walker," he greeted softly. "Thank you for letting us in today." Grace smiled, unlocking the door. "Of course, let's not waste time." They stepped inside. The air still carried the scent of lavender polish, the same fragrance she'd used for years. It was strange watching strangers step into her life's work, walking through rooms built with memories. But Grace reminded herself, memories can't be mortgaged, and dignity can't be stolen. The couple moved from room to room, voices hushed with admiration. "It's beautiful," the woman said. "Warm but modern. You can feel the care in every corner. And fully paid off," her husband added, glancing at Mr. Johnson. "That's rare." Mr. Johnson nodded. "All verified. Ownership clean. We'll handle this quietly. No neighborhood notices, no public listings." Grace followed them, silent but steady. Each compliment, each approving nod, it loosened the weight on her chest, piece by piece. They stopped in the living room. Sunlight pooled across the floorboards, golden and gentle. "We love it," the woman said. "If you're ready, we'd like to make an offer now." Grace met her gaze. "Then let's sit down." They gathered at the dining table, the same one where Ethan had once done his homework, where family dinners had stretched late into laughter and stories. Now it became a desk of liberation. Mr. Johnson spread out the forms, his voice calm, practiced. "This is a private sale. Payment in full upon closing. No agents, no advertisements. Discretion as agreed." The couple nodded eagerly. Pens moved. Pages turned. Signatures bloomed across paper. The ink dark, deliberate, final. And just like that, ownership began to shift. Not with shouting, but with signatures. When the deposit was handed over, Mr. Johnson slid a copy toward Grace. "It's done. The funds will clear by week's end." Grace traced the document with her fingertips. Her name, her power, her choice. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mr. Johnson closed his folder. "You've handled this with grace, no pun intended. And remember, this stays between us. Not a word to anyone until after transfer." She smiled faintly. "I prefer it that way." When they left, the door shut softly behind them. The echo lingered light, almost musical. Grace stood alone in the living room, the late afternoon sun stretching long across the floor. Her gaze swept the space. The couch where she'd read to Ethan as a boy, the rug John had chosen, the clock that ticked through birthdays and holidays. Her throat tightened, but her eyes stayed dry. "I've loved this house with everything I had," she whispered. "But now, I have to learn to love myself more." The words hung in the quiet, honest and whole. That evening, she returned to her small apartment. The city hummed outside, distant and low, but her room was calm. A sanctuary built on intent. She changed into her robe, brewed a cup of tea, and sat at the small wooden desk by the window. From her bag, she pulled out her notebook, the one that now held the chapters of her rebirth. Flipping past the old pages, "Today I am loved. Today I am awake. Today I begin." She opened to a fresh line. Her pen moved slowly, each word deliberate. Day 1. Taking back control. She read it aloud once, softly letting the truth settle into the room. Control the one thing they tried to take. Now it was hers again. She closed the notebook, exhaled deeply, and smiled. A small smile, not of joy, but of certainty. Because real strength doesn't roar. It simply moves quietly, confidently, like ink across paper, sealing a destiny rewritten by its rightful author. Morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden. Grace sat at her small kitchen table, sipping tea as the city began to stir outside. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt chosen. For the first time in years, silence belonged to her. Her phone buzzed, a message from Ethan. "Mom, can you watch the baby tomorrow? Chloe and I want to go out for the day." Once, she would have said yes without a thought before he even finished asking. Once, she believed love meant never refusing. But that version of her was gone. She set the cup down gently, reading the message again. Then, with steady fingers, she typed 2 simple words. "No, I'm busy." She pressed send. A quiet exhale left her lips, soft but full of power. 2 words, and yet they felt like a door closing on old habits. She looked out the window, a faint smile touching her face. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. An hour later, her phone rang. Ethan's name lit up the screen. "Mom?" His voice came a mix of surprise and confusion. "You're busy. Doing what?" Grace smiled softly, though he couldn't see it. "Things I've been meaning to do for a long time." A pause. Ethan hesitated, unsure how to respond. He'd never heard his mother say no, not once. "Okay," he murmured. "I guess we'll figure something out." "I'm sure you will," Grace said gently. "You're both capable." When the call ended, she sat for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. Not guilt, not regret, but pride. Saying no didn't break love. It just reshaped it into something honest, balanced, real. That evening, Chloe dropped by, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. "So, Ethan says you're busy tomorrow." Grace nodded, folding a stack of clothes into a box beside her. "That's right." Chloe leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You've been different lately, keeping things to yourself. Should we be worried?" Grace paused, then looked up, calm, unflinching. "Everyone has plans of their own, Chloe." Her voice carried no edge, no explanation. Just truth. Chloe smiled, thin, polite, then left the room. But Grace didn't look back. She turned to the box again, sealing it with tape. Inside were old photo frames, winter blankets, a set of china plates, things she no longer needed for a house that would no longer be hers. One by one, she labeled the boxes and stacked them neatly by the door. Tomorrow she'd send them to storage. Each item packed was a piece of closure. Each label a line between what was and what would be. In the quiet, Grace stood in the center of the room and looked around. This space had held so much laughter, arguments, Sunday dinners, broken promises. But tonight it felt lighter, not empty, liberated. She ran her hand along the mantel fingertips, brushing a thin layer of dust. "Boundaries," she whispered. "Small ones first." Then she smiled to herself, a soft, knowing smile. She didn't need to announce change. She just needed to live it. Later that night, she opened her notebook again, the one that now read like a map of her rebirth. "Today I am loved. Today I am awake. Today I begin, day 1. Taking back control." She turned to a fresh page and wrote slowly, carefully. Day 2. The first boundary. Her pen hovered, then added another line. Even a small no can build a wall strong enough to hold freedom. She closed the book, the sound of the cover snapping shut, echoing softly through the room. In the days that followed, Grace kept moving quietly, purposefully. More boxes filled, more shelves cleared. Each morning, she set one intention, to do one thing for herself. Some days, it was a walk through the park. Other days, a meal cooked just the way she liked, not the way anyone else preferred. Freedom. She was learning lived in the smallest choices. By the week's end, the storage unit stood ready, a small, clean space, with room enough for her history and her hope. Grace watched as the movers stacked her boxes carefully, each one labeled in her handwriting. "Is this everything, ma'am?" one of them asked. Grace nodded. "Everything I need to remember. Everything I need to release." When the truck pulled away, she stood there a while, the key warm in her hand. It wasn't loss, she felt. It was order. A life finally firmly back in her grasp. That night, she stood by her apartment window, watching the city lights shimmer across the glass. The reflection staring back wasn't the same woman from weeks ago. This one stood taller, even in stillness. Her voice calm and steady, carried through the quiet. Setting the first boundary, even a small one, is the first step toward freedom. The morning began quietly. Grace sat at her desk, the usual calm of her new routine settling around her like a soft blanket. The air smelled faintly of chamomile. In paper, the scent of peace earned not given. She had just finished sealing another box for storage when her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize flashed across the screen. She answered, her voice steady. "Hello." A man spoke polite firm. "Mrs. Walker, this is Mr. Davis, attorney at law. I'm reaching out because something's come to my attention, a file involving your property." Grace frowned, her hand tightening around the phone. "My property?" "Yes, ma'am. A mortgage application, recently filed under the names Ethan and Chloe Walker. The collateral listed is your home. The documents include an authorization, apparently signed by you." Silence. For a moment, the world went still. Grace felt her breath catch sharp and cold. I never signed anything." "That's what I suspected," Davis said. "I've reviewed the scanned file. The signature resembles yours exactly. But something about the timing and the notarization doesn't add up." Grace sank into her chair, fingers trembling. Her eyes darted to the folder on her desk, the one labeled proof. She had guarded every page, every line, every detail. And yet here it was again, deceit, wearing her own handwriting. "Can you send me a copy?" "Already on its way," Davis replied. "Check your email." Moments later, the screen lit up. There, in black and white, was her name, her flowing signature. The same loops and curves she'd practiced since childhood. She stared at it. And for a second, her chest tightened so hard, she thought it might crack. It looked exactly like hers, but it wasn't born from her hand. "It's my writing," she whispered. "My name, my ink. But it's their dagger." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but the sting of recognition. Betrayal had a shape now, a line of cursive, a forgery made to feel like family. On the other end of the line, Davis's tone steadied her. "Don't worry, Mrs. Walker. We can act immediately. I'll file a freeze order. It will block any pending loans or liens tied to the property until we verify authenticity." And what if they've already? They haven't. The bank flagged inconsistencies. Nothing's been released. Once your legal sale finalizes, all unauthorized claims will dissolve automatically. They'll have no standing, no leverage. Grace closed her eyes, breathing slowly through the ache. The law, steady, impartial, was now her ally. Where love had faltered, justice remained. "Thank you, Mr. Davis," she said quietly. "Please, do whatever it takes. Consider it done. I'll notify you once the freeze is confirmed." When the call ended, Grace sat in silence, staring at the faint reflection of her face in the computer screen, her eyes tired but fierce. She reached for her notebook, opened to a clean page, and began to write. "When trust is forged into a weapon, only law can shield you." She underlined the words twice. As the sun climbed higher, Grace walked slowly through her apartment, letting the reality settle. They had forged her name, her own child, her own blood, trying to chain her house, her freedom, her dignity to their greed. For a long time, she stood by the window, hands clasped before her. No tears came, only resolve. She'd cried all her tears already for the woman she used to be. Now she wasn't that woman anymore. She picked up her pen again and added beneath the last line, "This is no longer about love. This is about principle." Hours passed in quiet preparation. Grace gathered her folders, reviewed her documents, cross-checked every date, every receipt. Her once fragile faith in fairness had evolved no longer blind, but informed. Each page she handled reminded her she had built her life on honesty. If they wanted deceit, they'd have to fight in a language they didn't understand truth. That evening, the phone rang again. It was Davis. The freeze is confirmed. The bank won't process the mortgage. I've also filed a report for suspected forgery. We'll have handwriting experts verify. You're fully protected, Mrs. Walker. Grace let out a long, slow breath, a release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Protected, she repeated softly. That's a word I haven't felt in a long time. You've done everything right, he said. Selling the house legally puts you beyond their reach. Once the funds clear, you'll be untouchable. She nodded, though he couldn't see. Untouchable. I like that. After they hung up, Grace set the phone down and walked toward the mirror by her door. The woman staring back wasn't fragile anymore. She was focused, grounded a survivor with her own armor. And her armor wasn't anger. It was documentation, evidence, truth. Night descended softly, washing the room in silver light. Grace sat by the window once more, her notebook open, pen poised. She wrote a single line at the top of the page. Steady, precise. Day 3. The mask falls. Below it in smaller script, they wore kindness like a costume. But paper real legal, signed in light, never lies. She paused, then added one final note, the ink drying beneath her steady hand. When trust is forged into a weapon, only the law can protect you. She closed the notebook gently, the pages rustling like quiet applause. Because truth, even when buried, always finds its voice. And Grace was ready to let hers speak. The next morning began not with coffee, but with paperwork. Grace sat at her desk beside a stack of documents, her phone within reach, her pen steady. Every move now had purpose, every signature a shield. The first strike hadn't been hers, but the next 5 would be. Because this wasn't just survival anymore. This was strategy. By mid-morning, her attorney, Mr. Davis, called with news. They've filed for an emergency. Hold, he said, his voice calm but sharp. Chloe's claiming a right of residence and marital equity interest. She's asking the court to freeze the sale. Grace didn't flinch, can they? Not when the deed's in your name, and not when they acted without consent. He paused, then added, I've already filed a counter-motion. Mr. Johnson will represent the transaction. The judge is reviewing it today. Hours later, the ruling came through clear, concise, final. Petition denied. The court recognized full ownership, hers and hers alone. A silent victory inked in law. Grace exhaled slowly, a quiet smile crossing her lips. Round 1, she murmured, mine. But battles rarely end after the first win. That afternoon, a sharp knock rattled her apartment door. 2 uniformed officers stood outside. Mrs. Walker, we received a report alleged unlawful possession of shared property. Grace blinked once, then gestured politely toward her table. You're welcome to look, gentlemen. Everything here is documented, purchased in my name, paid with my money. She handed them copies of receipts and ownership lists, each page labeled, dated, notarized. They reviewed the files, exchanged glances, and nodded. Everything checks out, ma'am. False claim. We'll be closing this report. As they left, one officer paused by the door. For what it's worth, not many people this organized. Good job covering yourself. Grace smiled faintly. I learned that trust needs witnesses. The next day, a moving truck pulled up outside her old house. Grace arrived just in time, the sound of boxes scraping across the porch, the murmur of hired movers echoing through the air. Chloe stood by the truck barking orders. That and that, yes, load the sofa. Hurry. Grace stepped forward, calm but commanding. Put everything back. Chloe spun around, startled. You can't. I can. Grace interrupted, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. She lifted her phone. The police are already on their way. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up. The officer approached, reviewing the scene. Do you have proof of ownership, ma'am? Grace opened her briefcase, presenting the receipts, the invoices, the notarized inventory list. Every item accounted for. Every cent mine. The driver frowned, lowering the box in his hands. Ma'am, we're not getting paid enough for this. He motioned to his team. Unload everything. Now. One by one, the boxes returned to the porch. Chloe stood frozen, her face pale with disbelief. Grace didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply turned and walked away, each step echoing like punctuation. Later that week, Davis called again, voice laced with both surprise and admiration. "You won't believe this," he said. "They filed mental competency paperwork, a petition, claiming you're unfit to manage assets." Grace froze. "They're trying to declare me incapable. They submitted fabricated medical records. But they're careless. The dates don't match. The doctor doesn't exist." Grace's voice hardened. "Then we make it real." That afternoon, she met with her physician. Within hours, she held a signed statement confirming full mental clarity, cognitive, emotional, legal. She faxed it to Davis with a note, "File for perjury and forgery." 2 days later, another letter arrived. This time from the Adult Protective Services Department, a formal notice of investigation for alleged financial abuse. Chloe again. New mask, same motive. Grace read it once calmly. Then she gathered her records, bank statements, transaction histories, payment logs. Each one cross-referenced, annotated, complete. At the interview, the investigator asked gentle questions. Grace answered each with precision, fact by fact, document by document. When it was over, the woman smiled, closing her folder. "I wish all my cases were this easy." "You're free of suspicion, Mrs. Walker." Case closed. Grace nodded. False claims crumble faster than false love. That evening, her phone rang again. Ethan's voice came through, shaken, tired, uncertain. "Mom, this is getting out of hand. Chloe's upset. The lawyers, the police, can't we stop all this?" Grace's voice was calm, but beneath it, a quiet storm gathered. "Out of hand," she repeated softly. "No, son. This went too far the moment you chose deceit over honesty. I didn't mean, the day you forged my name, Ethan, that's the day you drew the line." Silence. Then a long exhale on the other end, heavy with something close to regret. But Grace didn't wait for apology. She ended the call not with anger, but with peace. Because justice didn't need noise. It needed proof. And she had plenty. That night, she opened her notebook again. The next chapter began with a steady hand, day 4. The legal counterstrike. Below it, she wrote, "They built a fortress of lies." I answered with walls of truth. They attacked with noise. I replied with evidence. She closed the book, resting her palm on the cover. For the first time in months, she felt something close to safety, not because the storm had passed, but because she had learned how to stand in it unshaken. The morning light was clear. No haze, no doubt, no hesitation. Grace woke early, her heart steady. The plan that began with whispers now stood ready to conclude with truth. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about resolution. The phone rang just after breakfast. Mr. Johnson's voice came through warm and professional. "Mrs. Walker, the buyers have requested to close a day early. They're ready to transfer funds as soon as the deed is handed over." Grace paused, then smiled. "Let's do it. I'm ready too." Outside, the world hummed quietly, unaware that somewhere justice was preparing to sign its name. By early afternoon, Grace arrived at the law office. Sunlight streamed across the polished table where the final documents waited. Mr. Johnson stood by briefcase, open every line, prepared, every page verified. And for the first time in months, Grace felt the simple, sacred weight of freedom within reach. But no victory comes without a final test. As the papers were set before her, the door burst open. A man in a dark suit strode in, briefcase in one hand, a stack of documents in the other. Behind him, Ethan and Chloe stood, pale, restless eyes darting like cornered thieves. The lawyer's voice was loud, forced. "We have a TRO, a temporary restraining order, to halt this sale immediately, filed on behalf of Ethan and Chloe Walker, claiming joint interest in the property." The room stiffened. Mr. Johnson glanced at Grace, calm, unflinching. He took the papers, scanned them quickly, then exhaled. "Fake," he said flatly. "No seal, no docket, no standing." He lifted his phone and without a word dialed the courthouse. Across the table, Chloe fidgeted. Ethan looked away. Within moments, Johnson's voice sharpened. "Your Honor, this is Johnson from Walker Realty. We've just received a fraudulent TRO presented under your court's name. I'm emailing it now." A pause. A response. Johnson's brow eased and he lowered the phone. The judge confirms no such order exists. They'll be sanctioned for misrepresentation. He turned back to Grace with a small nod. We're clear to proceed. Grace sat straighter, her expression serene. Her voice, however, was edged with quiet steel. Before we move on, I'll be recording this conversation for transparency. She tapped her phone, capturing every word that followed, every denial, every nervous excuse. It wasn't spite. It was evidence. Ethan muttered something about misunderstanding. Chloe's tone cracked under the weight of her own lies. But Grace didn't answer. She simply picked up her pen. With one smooth motion, she signed the deed. Her signature, real rightful, earned, the kind of ink that didn't wound but freed. Mr. Johnson slid a small set of keys across the table. The buyer smiled warmly, shaking her hand with gratitude. Moments later, her phone buzzed. Transaction complete. The balance shimmered on the screen, numbers aligned like proof of destiny. Funds cleared. Sale final. Freedom delivered. She placed the keys gently into the buyer's hand. Take good care of her, she said softly. She's been loved. They nodded. And in that simple exchange, a chapter closed. Ethan and Chloe stood frozen, disbelief painted across their faces. Their last move had failed. Their mask torn for all to see. Grace gathered her folder, rose calmly, and turned toward them. You didn't lose a house, she said. You lost the chance to be honest. No anger, no raised voice, just truth, clean and cold as glass. Then she walked out, the sound of her heels, soft, decisive final. But deception once cornered doesn't die quietly. By evening, another message came, this time from local authorities. A new complaint had been filed. Theft. Ethan and Chloe claimed she'd stolen property from the home. Grace almost laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. How far desperation could crawl when cornered by consequence. She met the officers with calm composure, handing over a neat folder. Invoices, photos, bank statements, serial numbers. Every item accounted for. Every claim disproven. The officer flipped through the documents, nodding. Everything's clear, ma'am. These are yours. Frankly, if I were you, I'd consider counteraction. Grace smiled gently. I'm not here to punish, just to finish. Days later, another call came from Davis. This time, there was no tension, only quiet satisfaction. We've uncovered something, he said. A credit account, opened in your name, false application, forged ID. The paper trail leads straight back to Chloe. Possibly Ethan, too. Grace closed her eyes, letting the words settle. Not with shock, but with acceptance. Every lie eventually surfaces. What happens now? The bank will press charges. Fraud's a serious offense. You don't need to lift a finger. Grace nodded. No need for vengeance. Truth has its own gravity. That evening she sat by her window. The sky bathed in the golden wash of sunset. The world outside shimmered, calm, expansive, unclaimed. She sipped her tea slowly, watching the light fade into dusk. The house was gone, yes. But the woman who built it, she remained. Whole, unbroken. She opened her notebook one last time, turning to a clean page. Day 5, the final move. Beneath it she wrote, Justice doesn't always wear robes or sit behind benches. Sometimes it's simply truth given time to breathe. Her pen hovered, then added one last line. Gentle, resolute. I don't need to win in court. I already won in clarity. She closed the book, setting it beside her cup. Outside the sky deepened into twilight, and Grace smiled softly, bathed in the quiet light of a life reclaimed. Sometimes she whispered, Justice needs no courtroom, only truth. In time. Morning came softly, not as an ending, but a beginning. The sky stretched open above the lake, painted in shades of gold and rose. And there, in a modest apartment, overlooking the still water, Grace stood by the window, a quiet smile resting on her lips, a new chapter resting in her hands. It wasn't large, it wasn't lavish, but it was hers. A small kitchen with sunlight pooling across the tiles. A desk by the window where she could write, read, and dream. A balcony with 2 clay pots waiting for new life to grow. She breathed in deeply, the air crisp with morning. No noise, no demands, no pretending. Just peace earned and chosen. The first thing she did that day was close every old account, every shared statement, every tie that once bound her name to someone else's mistakes. Then, with Davis's help, she opened a new system, fresh, secure, entirely her own. When she signed the asset protection package, she paused, pen hovering above the page. Then she wrote her name, steady, certain. Her signature no longer marked survival. It marked sovereignty. Later, at her new desk, Grace opened her familiar notebook, the one that had carried her through every storm. The pages before were filled with pain, resolve, and justice. But today, she turned to a clean sheet, blank, expectant, alive. She wrote in bold letters across the top, Day 1, a life of my own. The words sat there quietly, simple but strong, like roots beginning to form beneath fresh soil. She rested her hand over them, smiling faintly. For the first time in years, she wasn't writing to escape the past. She was writing to welcome the future. That afternoon, Grace joined a pottery class in town, her fingers shaping clay, turning it slow on the wheel. The instructor's voice was gentle, the air filled with soft laughter and spinning earth. Each bowl she molded wasn't perfect. A small tilt here, a rough edge there, but that made them real. Life she thought was the same, not flawless, but formed with care. Later, she walked along the lake with a local volunteer group, planting saplings along the shore. As she pressed the young roots into the ground, she whispered, "Grow slow, grow strong." And though the words were meant for the trees, they felt like a prayer for herself. In time, she began to know her neighbors, the elderly man who fed the ducks, the young mother with a toddler who waved Aaron every morning, the couple who brought her fresh bread on Sundays. They didn't know her story, and they didn't need to. They knew her now as the woman who smiled, who listened, who helped. One evening, as she shared tea with the woman next door, Grace looked out over the quiet lake, sunlight shimmering on the surface. The neighbor sighed softly. "You seem happy here." Grace nodded, eyes reflecting the fading light. "Happiness doesn't need luxury," she said. "It only needs respect." The woman smiled. "That sounds like peace." Grace returned the smile. "It is." That night, back at her desk, she opened her notebook once more. The page glowed beneath the lamplight. She began to write not from pain, but from clarity. "I did not win against anyone. I simply refused to let anyone win with injustice." She paused, the ink drying softly. Then she continued, "When love turns into leverage, walking away isn't weakness. It's dignity." Her pen moved slower now, the words flowing like breath. Sometimes the deepest revenge isn't rage or ruin. It's living so peacefully that there's nothing left for them to take. She set the pen down, reading the lines again, not as a defense, but as a truth. Outside, the moon hung low over the lake, its light rippling across the water like a quiet promise. Grace closed the notebook gently and turned off the lamp. She stood at the window, watching the stars blink awake, each one a reminder. Darkness is never final. A breeze drifted in, cool and kind. She let it brush her face, let it carry away the last traces of sorrow. In its place, there was only stillness and strength. She whispered into the night, not as a vow, but as a lesson, soft, steady, complete. "I didn't win against them. I simply refused to lose myself. And in that choice, I found peace." The lake shimmered below, the sky stretched wide above, and Grace finally was free.